He had milked alone for 15 years, never expecting company. But when Ruby Callahan appeared at his fence that morning, asking to learn what no woman had ever asked before, Silas Ward's carefully ordered world was about to shatter in ways he never imagined. The sun hung high over the ranch as Silas made his way to the barn, the same route he had walked every day since taking over the property. His boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each step, the leather worn smooth from years of the same routine. The cattle moved lazily in the distance, their bells creating a familiar rhythm that had become the soundtrack of his solitary existence. But today, something felt different. A figure stood by the wooden fence that bordered his property, small and still against the vast expanse of prairie grass. Silas squinted, his weathered hands instinctively reaching for the wide brim of his hat to shield his eyes from the glare. It had been months since anyone had ventured this far from town, and visitors were as rare as rain in drought season. As he drew closer, he could make out the silhouette more clearly. A young woman, her dark hair pulled back beneath a simple bonnet, her dress practical but well-mended. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her, watching him approach with a patience that seemed almost unnatural for someone her age. There was something in her posture that spoke of determination, a quiet strength that made Silas slow his pace despite himself. Ruby Callahan had been standing there for nearly an hour, working up the courage to speak. She had walked the 3 miles from town before dawn, her mind rehearsing the words she would use when the moment came. Now, face to face with the man whose reputation for solitude preceded him throughout the county, she felt her carefully planned speech threatening to abandon her entirely. Silas stopped a few feet from the fence, his blue eyes studying her with the same careful attention he gave to his cattle when checking for signs of illness or injury. He waited for her to speak first. A habit born from years of dealing with the occasional drifter or traveling salesman who might wander onto his land seeking directions or a meal. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the tall grass. Ruby felt her heart beating against her ribs, the sound so loud in her ears that she wondered if he could hear it too. Finally, she found her voice, though it came out smaller than she had intended. She told him she had heard he was the finest hand with cattle in 3 counties, that his methods were spoken of with respect even by men twice his age. She explained that she needed to learn, that circumstances had forced her to seek skills that most women never considered necessary. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, the initial nervousness giving way to the genuine urgency that had driven her to make this journey. Silas listened without interruption, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat brim. He had heard desperate requests before, usually from men down on their luck seeking work or shelter. But this was different. No woman had ever asked him to teach her the intimate details of ranch work, the skills that required patience, strength, and an understanding of animals that took years to develop. When she finished speaking, Ruby waited for his response, her hands gripping the rough wood of the fence post. She could see him considering her words, weighing them against something she could not understand. The morning air felt thick with possibility and rejection in equal measure. Silas found himself studying her hands as she spoke, noting the calluses on her palms and the way her fingers moved with unconscious precision when she gestured. These were not the soft hands of a town woman who had never known hard work. Whatever had brought her here, it was not mere curiosity or romantic notions about ranch life. The cattle began moving toward the barn, their internal clocks telling them it was time for the morning routine. Silas glanced toward them, then back at Ruby, caught between his ingrained habits and this unexpected disruption to his carefully maintained isolation. But what Ruby said next would change everything he thought he knew about keeping the world at arm's length. Ruby's voice dropped to barely above a whisper as she revealed the truth that had driven her to his fence. Her father was gone, taken by fever 3 weeks ago, leaving behind debts that threatened to consume everything her family had built. Her mother, overwhelmed by grief and responsibility, had fallen into a state that left Ruby as the sole provider for her younger siblings. The bank had given them until month's end to produce payment, or they would lose the small plot of land that had been their anchor for generations. She explained that she had heard cattle could provide steady income through milk and butter, products that town families would pay well for if the quality was exceptional. But knowing something in theory and having the skill to execute it were entirely different matters. She needed someone who understood not just the mechanics of milking, but the subtleties that separated adequate work from the kind of expertise that could save a family from destitution. Silas felt something shift inside his chest as he listened to her story, a sensation he had not experienced in years. The isolation he had carefully cultivated suddenly felt less like protection and more like selfishness. He found himself remembering his own father's teachings, the patient way the older man had shown him how to read the moods of cattle, how to approach them with the right balance of confidence and gentleness. Ruby's eyes held a desperation that was carefully controlled, the kind of desperation that came from having exhausted all other options before arriving at his fence. She was not asking for charity or pity, but for the chance to earn the knowledge that might save her family. There was something in her bearing that reminded him of his younger self, when he had first taken on responsibilities that seemed impossibly large. The cattle had reached the barn and were beginning to gather near the gate, their routine as predictable as sunrise. Silas could feel their expectant presence, the way they shifted and moved in anticipation of the morning ritual. For 15 years this had been his solitary domain, a place where he worked in silence broken only by the sounds the animals made. He looked at Ruby again, noting the way she watched the cattle with genuine interest rather than fear. Most town people approached his animals with nervous uncertainty, but she seemed to study them the way he might examine a piece of machinery he was trying to understand. Her attention was focused and respectful, qualities that were essential for working with livestock. The morning sun was climbing higher, and Silas knew that his routine was being disrupted with each passing minute. The cattle were patient, but they thrived on consistency, and any deviation from their expected schedule could affect their mood and productivity for the entire day. He needed to make a decision, but found himself caught between the comfortable predictability of solitude and something else he could not quite name. Ruby seemed to sense his internal struggle. She straightened her shoulders and took a small step back from the fence, as if preparing herself for rejection. The movement was subtle but decisive, showing that she understood the magnitude of what she was asking, and was prepared to accept whatever answer he gave her. But as Silas opened his mouth to respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the prairie. Both of them turned toward the dust cloud rising in the distance, and Silas felt his jaw tighten as he recognized the distinctive rhythm of multiple horses moving at speed. Someone was coming, and they were coming fast. Ruby's face went pale as she followed his gaze, her hands instinctively gripping the fence post tighter. The approaching riders could mean many things, but none of them were likely to be good news for a young woman standing alone at the property of a man known for his reclusiveness. The timing could not have been worse, and Silas realized that whatever decision he made about Ruby's request would have to wait. But the way she stood her ground, despite the obvious threat approaching, told him more about her character than all her words had revealed. The riders emerged from the dust cloud with the precision of men accustomed to making intimidating entrances. 3 of them, led by a heavy-set man whose expensive coat looked out of place against the rugged landscape. Silas recognized him immediately, Marcus Brennan, the banker who held mortgages on half the properties in the county. Behind him rode 2 younger men whose hands rested too casually near their holsters, the kind of men who were hired for reasons that had nothing to do with banking. Ruby's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the lead rider. This was exactly what she had been trying to avoid by coming to Silas before dawn, hoping to conclude their business before anyone in town noticed her absence. But fate seemed determined to complicate every aspect of her desperate plan. Brennan brought his horse to a stop just outside the fence line, his cold eyes moving between Silas and Ruby with the calculating gaze of a man who saw opportunity in other people's misfortune. His smile was the practiced expression of someone who had delivered bad news so often it had become routine. He addressed Ruby first, his voice carrying the false warmth that barely concealed underlying menace. He expressed surprise at finding her so far from town, especially when there were pressing matters that required her attention. The way he emphasized certain words made it clear that her presence here was both unexpected and unwelcome from his perspective. Silas felt his muscles tense as he watched the exchange. He had dealt with Brennan before, years ago when the banker had tried to pressure him into selling portions of his land for development. The conversation had ended with Brennan understanding that some men were not easily intimidated, but Silas suspected that Ruby would not have the same luxury of resistance. Ruby straightened her spine and met Brennan's gaze directly, though Silas could see the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed her fear. She told the banker that she was conducting personal business and would return to town when her affairs were concluded. Her voice carried more confidence than her body language suggested, but Silas recognized the courage it took to stand firm against men who held her family's future in their hands. Brennan's smile widened, but the warmth never reached his eyes. He informed Ruby that circumstances had changed since their last conversation. that new information had come to light regarding her father's debts. The timeline for repayment had been accelerated, and alternative arrangements would need to be discussed immediately. The two men behind Brennan shifted in their saddles, a subtle movement that drew attention to their presence without being overtly threatening. Silas recognized the tactic: create pressure without crossing lines that might bring unwanted attention from territorial authorities. Ruby's face went white as Brennan continued speaking, outlining terms that were clearly designed to be impossible to meet. Silas found himself stepping closer to the fence, his protective instincts responding to something he could not quite identify. The cattle behind him began moving restlessly, sensing the tension that was building between the humans. But when Brennan made his final offer, Ruby's response would force Silas to choose between the safety of isolation and something far more dangerous. Brennan's final offer came wrapped in the language of false generosity, but its true nature was unmistakable. He suggested that Ruby could work off her family's debt through employment at his establishment in town, a place where young women provided entertainment for traveling businessmen and cattle buyers. The way he phrased it made it sound respectable, but everyone present understood the reality of what he was proposing. Ruby's response was immediate and fierce. She rejected his offer, with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. Her voice carrying the strength of someone who would rather face destitution than surrender her dignity. The words came out like hammer blows, each one driving home her absolute refusal to consider his proposition. Silas felt something ignite in his chest as he watched Ruby stand her ground against odds that would have broken many people. Her courage in the face of overwhelming pressure reminded him of why he had once believed in fighting for things that mattered. Before isolation had taught him that caring led only to disappointment and loss, Brennan's facade of politeness began to crack as Ruby's defiance became clear. He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice taking on the harder edge that he typically reserved for foreclosure proceedings. He reminded her that pride was a luxury her family could no longer afford, that practical solutions required practical sacrifices. The two men behind Brennan moved their horses slightly closer, creating a subtle but unmistakable sense of encirclement. Silas recognized the positioning as an intimidation tactic, designed to make Ruby feel trapped and overwhelmed. His hands slowly clenched into fists as he watched the scene unfold. Ruby glanced briefly at Silas, and in that moment, he saw something that cut through 15 years of carefully maintained detachment. She was not looking for rescue or salvation, but for witness, someone to see that she had faced this moment with courage, regardless of the outcome. The look lasted only seconds, but it conveyed more than hours of conversation could have managed. Brennan seemed to interpret Ruby's glance as a sign of weakness rather than strength. He suggested that perhaps her new friend might be willing to offer assistance, his tone making it clear that he viewed Silas as another potential source of leverage rather than an obstacle to his plans. Silas found himself speaking before he had consciously decided to intervene. His voice was calm, but carried the unmistakable authority of a man who was accustomed to being taken seriously. He informed Brennan that Ruby was conducting business on his property as his invited guest, and that any further conversation regarding her affairs could be conducted at a more appropriate time and location. The banker's eyes narrowed as he reassessed the situation. Silas Ward was not someone who could be easily intimidated or manipulated, and his intervention complicated what should have been a straightforward collection matter. Brennan's calculation was visible as he weighed the potential consequences of pushing too hard against a man with Silas's reputation. The tension stretched between the group like a wire pulled too tight, each person waiting for someone else to make the next move. The cattle behind Silas continued their restless movement, their discomfort adding an undercurrent of urgency to the standoff. Ruby watched the exchange with growing amazement. No one had stood up to Brennan on her behalf since her father's death, and she had not expected protection from a man she had met only minutes before. But she also understood that Silas's intervention might have consequences that extended far beyond her immediate situation. Brennan's response would determine whether this confrontation ended with retreat or escalation into something far more dangerous. Brennan's smile returned, but it carried a coldness that had not been there before. He acknowledged Silas's words with the careful politeness of a man who was storing information for future use. The banker made it clear that he respected property rights and would not presume to conduct business where he was not welcome. But his tone suggested that this courtesy had limits. He turned his attention back to Ruby, reminding her that debts had a way of growing larger when left unattended, and that alternative solutions became scarcer with each passing day. His words were chosen carefully to stay within legal boundaries while making his message unmistakably clear. This reprieve was temporary, and the consequences of continued defiance would be severe. Silas stepped closer to the fence, his movement deliberate and unmistakable in its intent. He had spent 15 years avoiding exactly this kind of involvement, but something about Ruby's situation had awakened instincts he thought he had successfully buried. The protective impulse felt both foreign and familiar, like remembering how to use muscles that had been dormant for too long. Ruby sensed the shift in dynamics, but also understood the danger that Silas was accepting on her behalf. She had come seeking knowledge, not protection, and certainly not the kind of conflict that could follow a man for years. Her original plan had been to learn quickly and disappear back to town before anyone noticed her absence. But events had spiraled beyond her control. Brennan gathered his reins, preparing to leave, but his final words carried the weight of a promise rather than a threat. He informed Ruby that he would expect to see her in town before the week's end to discuss practical arrangements for her family's situation. The emphasis he placed on practical made his meaning clear to everyone present. As the three riders prepared to depart, one of Brennan's men let his gaze linger on the cattle in a way that made Silas's jaw tighten. The look was too calculating, too evaluative, suggesting that this confrontation might have consequences beyond Ruby's immediate problems. Men like Brennan rarely forgot when their authority was challenged, and they had long memories for perceived slights. The sound of hoofbeats gradually faded as the riders disappeared back toward town, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the one that had preceded their arrival. Ruby remained motionless by the fence, her hand still gripping the wooden post as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored to the ground. Silas found himself studying her profile, noting the way she held herself despite everything that had just transpired. There was steel in her spine that reminded him of his own father's stories about the kind of people who had built their lives in impossible places through sheer determination and refusal to surrender. The cattle were becoming increasingly restless, their routine disrupted by the morning's events. Silas knew that he needed to attend to them, but he also understood that his conversation with Ruby had reached a point where everything would be different, depending on what happened next. When Ruby finally spoke, her words would seal both their fates in ways that neither of them could have anticipated. Ruby turned to face Silas directly, her eyes bright with unshed tears, but her voice steady with resolve. She told him that she could not ask him to risk his peace for her problems, that she had witnessed enough to understand that his intervention might bring consequences he had not chosen. Her gratitude was genuine, but so was her determination not to drag him deeper into her family's troubles. Silas found himself caught between admiration for her integrity and frustration at her willingness to shoulder impossible burdens alone. He had spent years convincing himself that isolation was wisdom, but watching Ruby prepare to walk away felt like watching someone step deliberately into a flood rather than accept a rope thrown from shore. She began to move away from the fence, her decision apparently made, but Silas spoke her name with enough authority to stop her retreat. The sound of his voice saying her name seemed to surprise them both. He had not used another person's name in conversation for longer than he cared to remember, and she had not expected him to try to change her mind. He told her that teaching someone to work with cattle was not charity, but practical exchange. She needed skills, and he needed assistance with tasks that had become increasingly difficult to manage alone. His hip had been bothering him more each morning, and the heavy lifting required for proper barn maintenance was taking longer than it once had. Her presence would be mutually beneficial rather than one-sided obligation. Ruby studied his face carefully, looking for signs that he was manufacturing reasons to help her out of misplaced pity. But what she saw in his expression was the same practical assessment he might give to evaluating livestock or judging weather patterns. He was stating facts rather than making emotional appeals, which somehow made his offer more believable than any amount of sympathetic encouragement. The cattle had reached the point where their routine could not be delayed any longer without affecting their comfort and productivity. Silas gestured toward the barn, explaining that the morning milking needed to happen regardless of whatever other complications had arrived with the sunrise. If Ruby was serious about learning, she could begin immediately by observing how he worked with the animals. Ruby hesitated for only a moment before nodding her acceptance. She understood that this was likely her only opportunity to gain the knowledge she desperately needed, and that refusing his offer out of excessive pride would serve no one's interests. She climbed over the fence with surprising agility, her movements showing the kind of physical competence that came from a life that had never been entirely easy. As they walked toward the barn together, Silas found himself explaining the basics of cattle behavior and the importance of consistency in handling. Ruby listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that every detail might be crucial, asking questions that demonstrated she was thinking beyond the immediate task to the broader applications of what she was learning. The first cow they approached was Belle, a patient animal who had been part of Silas's herd for nearly a decade. She watched Ruby's approach with mild curiosity but without alarm, her calm demeanor making her ideal for demonstration purposes. Silas showed Ruby how to position herself, how to read the animal's mood through subtle physical cues, and how to establish the rhythm that would make the process comfortable for both human and cow. But as Ruby placed her hands on the warm sides of the animal and began to attempt her first milking, the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached them again. This time, however, the rhythm was different, faster, more urgent, and coming from the opposite direction of town. The approaching rider was a young boy, no more than 12 years old, pushing his horse harder than the animal was meant to be driven. His face was streaked with tears and dust, and his clothes suggested he had left home in desperate haste. As he drew closer to the barn, both Silas and Ruby could see the panic in his eyes that spoke of emergency beyond normal childhood troubles. Ruby recognized him immediately. Tommy, her youngest brother, who should have been home helping their mother with the morning chores. The fact that he had ridden the family's only remaining horse to find her meant that something terrible had happened in the few hours since she had left for Silas's ranch. Tommy practically fell from his horse as he reached them, his words tumbling out in a breathless rush that made them difficult to understand. Their mother had collapsed during the night, unable to wake properly, speaking words that made no sense when she could speak at all. The doctor had been summoned, but he needed payment before he would provide treatment, and there was no money left for medical expenses. Silas watched Ruby's face transform as she absorbed her brother's news. The careful composure she had maintained throughout the morning's confrontations crumbled as she realized that her family's crisis had deepened beyond anything she had imagined possible. The knowledge she had come to gain suddenly seemed irrelevant compared to the immediate necessity of getting medical help for her mother. Tommy grabbed Ruby's arm with the desperate grip of a child who had been forced to carry responsibilities far beyond his years. He told her that their neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, was watching the younger children, but that everyone was frightened and looking to Ruby for solutions she did not possess. The weight of being the family's sole hope was written clearly across his young face. Ruby's mind raced through calculations that had no positive outcomes. Even if she could convince the doctor to treat their mother on credit, the existing debt to Brennan meant that any additional obligations would only deepen their impossible situation. The choice between her mother's immediate health and the family's long-term survival was no choice at all. Silas found himself watching this family drama unfold with emotions he had not allowed himself to feel for years. The boy's raw desperation and Ruby's obvious anguish cut through his carefully maintained emotional barriers, like a knife through paper. He thought of his own family, lost to fever years ago, and the helplessness he had felt when money and connections had meant nothing against the reality of illness. Without consciously making the decision, Silas reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a leather pouch that contained his emergency funds, money he had saved for equipment repairs and unexpected expenses. He pressed it into Ruby's hands with an authority that brooked no argument, telling her that family came before everything else, including pride. Ruby stared at the pouch in her hands, understanding immediately that it contained more money than her family had seen in months. But accepting it would create a debt that went far beyond anything she could repay through learning ranch skills. The implications of his generosity were as overwhelming as they were necessary. As Tommy urged his sister toward their horse, Ruby faced the most difficult decision of her life, whether to accept help that would save her mother but bind her to obligations she could not fulfill,